Hey guys, how's it going? Today I'm going to be showing you 10 different watercolor techniques that you can experiment with. So this is just supposed to be a fun, sort of relaxing activity where you're just trying out different methods of using watercolor with other household supplies that you probably have somewhere in your home. So just to show you where I was experimenting earlier with different things, so I'm going to be showing you a few of these and a few more. But first let me talk about what supplies you'll need. So you're going to need a sketchbook. If you have your sketchbook, that's probably going to be the best paper that you have. However, if you do have watercolor paper at home, that is perfect. Definitely use watercolor paper. The biggest difference is that watercolor paper doesn't wrinkle the paper as easily when you go over it with water. A regular sketchbook will get a little bit wrinkly. It's okay, we're just having fun today, no big deal. But if you do have watercolor paper, that is awesome. So some things that you are going to need are a cup of water. It can be any size cup, I'm just using a small one. But you are going to need another cup that is on the smaller side, so I have these little Tupperwares I'm just using. You're going to need your watercolor set, so just the same set that you've been using, and a brush. If you have a brush that's bigger, about this size, that's perfect. If all you have is your smaller one, it's okay. You might want to work a little bit smaller, but this is a good size if you've got something like that. You're also going to need some salt. So regular table salt from your kitchen would be perfect, but you can use any kind of salt that you have. You're going to need a Q-tip or something similar, and rubbing alcohol. So you'll probably find this somewhere in your medicine cabinet. It doesn't matter what percentage it is. The higher percent will work better for the effect, but any kind of rubbing alcohol will do. If you have one, you're going to need a spray bottle. I'm going to show you a spray bottle technique. If you don't have any of these things, obviously, it's okay. You can still watch, and then if you have them later, you can experiment with them, but hopefully you have a spray bottle somewhere. You're also going to need plastic wrap, or cling film, as some people call it. So this sort of wrinkly, sticky, shiny stuff that you might have in your pantry somewhere. And in addition to plastic wrap is parchment baking paper. So something that looks a little bit like this. And then other things that you will need for the demo today are something to scratch with, something pointy. You can use a knife, just be very, very careful. I'm just using this little end of this flosser tool that I have here. It can be helpful to have a pair of scissors on hand as well. You want to have some kind of plastic. If you have a gift card that obviously doesn't have any money left over on it, that's going to be probably the best thing. However, you can use probably a lot of different kinds of thicker plastics. And then if you've got one, this is kind of optional, but a half teaspoon measuring spoon, and this is for measuring out salt later. You can probably eyeball the amount of salt to use, however, I just have it on hand just because I had it. And then the first thing that you are going to want to do is to break up your sketchbook spread into 10 boxes. So I've already labeled these with each of the experimental techniques that we're going to be doing today. So the way I made these boxes, you can make them pretty messy. They don't have to be perfect, but I did use my Micron pen so that it wouldn't bleed with the watercolor. And I also used a set of Post-it notes, and I just traced it 10 times. So if you need to take a moment to draw those boxes, make sure that you do so beforehand. However, they don't have to be perfect. Okay, so the first technique I'm going to show you today is a wash. Now this is going to look very similar to a technique that we did earlier in class, and that is called wet on wet. The big difference here is that a wash is just a bigger area of space. So trying to get my area. I have a lot of technology around me, so I'm trying not to get water on anything. So if you're in an area where there's no technology, that's probably a better place to paint. So with your wash, bring the camera a little bit closer over here. So basically what you're doing is you're getting water on your brush, dab off a little bit of the extra water. We're not working on watercolor paper here, so the water will absorb into the paper very quickly. Go ahead and go across the top of your box here. Push it down. You're just trying to get the paper slightly damp with a little tiny bit of water. Not soaking. We don't want puddles of water because that's going to make a huge mess. Then go ahead and choose a color. I'm going to go in with yellow. just like with the wet on wet technique, the paint is going to spread very quickly around the water. And you can kind of help it a little bit, push it around here and there. I'm going to clean my brush because I want to go into a new color. And I'm going to go into, actually I'm going to get a little bit of water off there. I'm going to go into the orange. And I'm going to put it right next to my yellow. This is very similar to wet on wet. You're just doing a larger area of space here. And I'm noticing puddles of water building up here. I'm kind of pushing them around to keep them from getting too puddly. However, keep in mind that you're probably going to end up with some puddles of water here and there. It's okay. We're just having fun today. And I'm going to go into the red and have that be my last color. So as your colors dry, they're going to swirl together and do a lot of cool stuff. And if you want, be very careful. You could add a little bit more water here and there on the edges of the colors to help them blend together even more. So that's your wash. So next up, what we're going to do is the baking paper. The reason why I showed you guys the wash is because this is pretty much the foundation for almost all of the other techniques that we're going to do. So you're going to want to keep the way we did this in mind. So I'm going to grab a piece of baking paper. And I'm going to cut it to about the size of the square I have. It's probably a little bit bigger. That's a good size. Okay. So I'm going to do the same technique that I did here to create my wash. And then we're going to be putting the baking paper on top of it. However, there's an important component to this, so make sure you're paying attention. I'm just going to put some water on the paper. I think I'm going to go in with my blue this time. Not really worrying about staying inside the lines here. We're just playing around today. I don't want this to get too wet, but I also don't want it to get too dry either. We're looking for just the right amount of wetness on the paper. And I think I'm going to put some purple in there too. So I'm trying to build up these really rich areas of color. The more rich your color is, the more intense the baking paper effect is going to be. Okay. Okay. So it looks pretty good. It doesn't look like it's too wet. There's a few little puddles here and there, but I'm going to go ahead and stick my baking paper on top of that and see how that's sort of suctioning onto the surface there. However, your baking paper might want to peel up a little bit, so hold it down for a little bit. It should stick pretty well as long as your paint is wet enough. If it's not wet enough, you're going to want to put a little bit more water on there. So I'm sort of holding this down here, trying to get it to stick as best as I can. If you've got some tape, you could also tape it down. That might be helpful as well. And I'm going to leave that as it is. We're going to come back to that because that needs to dry before we peel it back up. Okay, so actually, you know what? I'm going to put my watercolor set slightly on top of it. Okay, so next we're going to do the salt technique. You might have seen this somewhere before because this is a pretty popular technique to use. So go ahead and you can either do a wash or you can just put color directly onto the paper. You know what? I think I'm going to do that. I think I'm going to just go in here and put color directly on the paper. Both ways will work if you do wet on wet or wet on dry. I'm going to do a few colors. It's always more fun when you do a few different colors. Kind of see what happens. The reason why I do advise that you actually maybe do wet on dry here is because in order for the salt effect to finish, it needs to dry completely. Similar to the baking paper, you want that to dry completely before you peel it back up. So it might be better in the long run to do a wet on dry here. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take my little empty cup that I have. I'm going to take my table salt, and here I'm going to just put a little teeny tiny amount in there, not a whole lot. Now you can either pinch this with your fingers or you can gently sprinkle it. The reason why I wouldn't advise sprinkling it from the big thing is because it might just go all over the place and then you just have a giant mess. I'm going to take my fingers, get a little bit of salt, and start sprinkling it onto my paint. And you'll start to see things happen. It's not going to look completely cool until it's dry, but you will start to see little galaxies explode out of your colors. The salt absorbs the water. It pulls it towards the little grains of salt, similar to how it stops ice from forming on your driveway in the winter. Might be a little bit of overkill with the salt, but you know, I want to see what happens. And I'm going to just very gently dust off any extra salt. That's probably why it's better to just pinch it and pour it on that way, because we don't want the salt to contaminate too much with other things. Okay, so that's pouring salt directly onto the paper. The next one I'm going to show you is salt water. So what we're doing here is we're going to take that same cup that we used for the salt and take a moment to fill it up with water. So I'll be right back. Okay, so I've got my water. I don't have a lot of salt in here just yet because we used a lot of that salt for when we did this one. So instead, we're going to put a little bit more salt into the water. I'm going to put that ½ teaspoon. Maybe a little less, a little more. Your effect should be pretty strong regardless. I'll pour that into my water. I'm going to take my brush and I'm going to mix it for a while. You want all of the salt to be completely dissolved into the water. If it's not, when you paint the water on for your wash, for your saltwater wash, you're going to see little grains of salt, which isn't necessarily a super big deal, but the technique is not quite as pure as what we're looking for here, if that happens. So I'm just going to keep stirring for a little bit, kind of looking to see if all of those grains are dissolved. Okay. Okay, so we've got our brush, and it's soaked in salt water. I'm going to get a little bit off just so that's not completely soaking. And then I'm going to do the same way that we started the wash. I'm going to lay down a layer of water. I like to go over it a few times just so that it's distributed evenly around the box. Okay, so now what you want to do is try to get some of the extra salt water off of your brush on your paper towel and then clean it in the non-salt water, in the regular clean tap water. Okay, now I'm going to go into a color. This one's probably one of the most exciting ones, I think. I'm going to go into the blue. My blue is still pretty wet. I'm going to tap it into the salt water. I think I might actually put a little bit more salt water on there. I'm noticing it's not quite. I'm going to do a good layer here. Might be a little bit runny. Going to go back into my color. There we go. So you get these little fireworks happening in your water. Try to zoom in on that a little bit there. you get these really cool little bursts of color. I'm going to do that with my red. It looks cooler when you're doing it in front of you, but look at how that salt water is helping the color to bleed around. And I like to do this with a few colors. You might want to put your salt water aside so that you don't accidentally use it while you're cleaning your brush between your colors. This is a similar effect to if you mix a little bit of bleach in with your water. I'm obviously not going to show you guys that just because bleach is a dangerous thing to play around with. However, you know, on your own time if you want to try that out carefully, by all means. But salt water does a pretty similar trick. I'm going to do some orange. The more puddly the water is, the further it's going to spread around. I'm going to do some more blue. I like to put the colors in between each other and see how they mix together. It's exciting to see. So over here the paper's not quite as wet, so it's not really spreading as much, but over here there's a good amount. And you can really play around with different color combinations, seeing what all happens. I like to try to fill in all these white spaces. And you want to be careful because, you know, I have sort of a puddle over here, and those colors will all run down towards that puddle, and then you might get a little bit of a brownish, grayish color. But that's the joy of experimenting, seeing what happens when you do things. It almost looks like tie-dye in a way, the way it sort of bursts from the center of wherever you put those colors. And then the colors kind of bump up against each other and they mix. And they do cool things. So that's the salt water technique. So now might be a good time to clean your regular tap water and empty your salt water, just so that you don't get confused. So I'm going to go do that for just a second. Okay. Clean tap water. All right. So next technique we're going to do is using tissues, just regular tissues like you use to blow your nose with. So I've got one right here. Move the camera over a little bit. I've got salt all over my desk. That's fine though. Cleaning up is just part of the artistic process. Okay. So for tissues, we're going to do another wash, meaning that we're going to do a very light layer of water and then tap a few colors into that water. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and get some water on my brush. I'm going to wipe off the excess so it's not soaking wet. And I'm going to come over here and just do a nice gentle swipe of water. Okay. I'm going to get a color, I think, What should I do? I've done a lot of yellow and red, so I think I'm going to do another bluey, purpley sort of thing. That's a nice wash when the color moves easily like that. It means that you've got just the right amount of water on your paper. I think I'm going to do a green this time with my blue. I love the way blue and purple looks together, but sometimes you gotta shake it up a little bit. I don't want this to dry too fast. I'm using a pretty good amount of water, not too much where it's soaking wet, because we don't want it to stay wet for too long either. We want it to kind of be a careful balance of not soaking, but not too dry. I think that's pretty cool. This sort of blue and green. I know some of you guys said your favorite color combo was blue and green. I like that. It reminds me of the earth. Okay, now we're going to take a moment to let this just dry for just a second. We're not going to wait too long, because if we wait too long, it's not quite going to work. One thing that might be cool that you might want to try, and you could also do this with your salt water because it's soaking wet, is sometimes if you pick up your paper and move it around, the colors will sort of run. That's like a little bonus technique that you can do. You can turn it to the side. My salt water is getting all over the place. So you can turn it, move it diagonally. That's fun. Just see what happens. Oops. Okay. So I'm going to take my tissue. I'm going to fold it a few times, and then I'm going to twist it like you're wringing out a towel. There's a lot of different things you can do with your tissue for this technique. This is one that I find fun. It's just wringing it tightly. And you can sort of tap it onto your paper and push it in. And if we have the right amount of water, where it's not too wet, it should work. Sometimes it takes a little bit of practice. Okay, so see how that sort of lifted out some color. It left a little fun stripe. And I know it's kind of hard to see because of the lighting, but try this a few times and do it a few different ways. And you're also kind of tie-dyeing your tissue at the same time, which is fun. Another thing I like to do is, again, wring my tissue, but then twist it into like a little loop here. I'll put it on the paper in a spot that's not too wet. Just hold it down for a second and lift it off. And it's sort of like a stamp. I know it's a little bit tricky to see, but it'll look cooler when you're doing it in person. So it's a fun way to make little stamp-like effects in your paint. Twist this again. Try to twist it tight. And I think I'm going to do this in a wetter spot this time and see what happens. So I'm laying it down and pushing it into the paper. And that tissue is absorbing the paint underneath it. I'm going to hold this down for a little bit longer this time. See what happens. Yeah, cool. So it's sort of leaving these little spots of empty areas. So try a few different things with your tissue. Try different shapes. You can also sort of tap it into the paper. That might be cool too. Leave little ghosty effects wherever you place it. And try this with different amounts of wetness on the paper. Maybe it needs to be a little bit drier. Maybe it needs to be a little bit wetter. But now that it's drying, I can see these little stripes I made here even better. They might not show up until the paint is dry. So I'm going to do another one here. And if you're working on watercolor paper, this effect will probably be stronger too, because the paper doesn't absorb so quickly the water. And sometimes if you're trying to create clouds, can sort of ball up your tissue and then actually go in there and buff out the color as well. Just be careful not to rub too hard. Okay, so that's your tissue technique, and next we're going to do the spray bottle. So I just have a regular spray bottle. It's just full of water. However, keep in mind that spray bottles usually have a nozzle that you can adjust. If it's looser, that means it's going to give you a thick stream of water, which you don't want here. If it's too tight, like let's say I turn this all the way tight, it's not going to spray at all. We want it to be somewhere in between, where it sprays pretty good sized droplets of water. I think that's good. Pretty good sized droplets, but not too fine of a mist. So maybe test it out in your bathroom or your kitchen a couple of times to get it to be a good amount. And you'll see what I mean by how this affects it when we go in here. So to do this one, I'm actually not going to do a wash. I'm just going to do a wet on dry, because the spray bottle won't work as well if your paper is soaking. So I don't know what color I want to do this time. I'm always so indecisive about that. I think, so usually this will work better if you're using a brighter color. Yellow doesn't really show up as well just because it's very light. So a blue, a purple, a red are probably your best bets. So I think I'm gonna do a blue and red. And I think I'm gonna do stripes this time. I usually do big blotchy things, but this time I think I'm gonna just do little horizontal guys. Make sure you clean your brush in between your colors so that you don't mess up your watercolor set. Get some water off so it's not soaking wet. I'm going to try to make sure these colors are nice and bright. Couple of layers here. Okay. So now we're going to take the spray bottle. I'm going to give this a second to just air dry for just a moment. So make sure your spray bottle is on a setting where it's about in between loose and tight. I'm going to put my hand here so that I don't spray my keyboard that I have. And then I'm just going to give it one little spritz there. And it might be hard to see on camera, but this is kind of similar to how the salt technique looks. It leaves little speckles of lighter areas because the color is lifting off some of the paint. Do one more. The more you do it, the more intense the effect is going to be, and see how the colors are bleeding together too. We know that more water means that those colors will spread. Yeah, see that? That's really cool. The blue going into the red. I'm gonna do one more spray. I just like seeing what happens. Ooh. And I'm just, because I'm so tempted, I'm gonna pick it up and move it around. Okay, excellent. So that's your spray bottle technique. Next up, this one's one of my favorites, but it also is kind of weird to look at the same time, and that's using rubbing alcohol. So let's go ahead and do another wet on dry coverage of the square. So I think I'm gonna do, you know what, I'm gonna do blue and purple again because I just can't help myself. I just love it so much. And I'm gonna do these big swirly guys. I want this color to be pretty intense so that the rubbing alcohol will give you a more intense look when you apply it to the surface. So we're just using water and paint here. Wet on dry. Nothing fancy just yet. But we will get fancy, don't worry. Okay. Clean my brush, get extra water off. Don't want it to be too wet. Okay, and we're going to give that a second to dry because we want it to be fairly dry before we go in there. So while we're waiting for that, I'm actually going to come over here and peel off the baking paper. So you can see how it left these sort of little effects in here. I think the baking paper might have gotten unstuck a little bit while I was working, so it might be a good idea to hold it down pretty tight while you're working. I'm actually going to give it a little bit of another spray just to see if I can get the effect to be a little bit stronger. And I'm going to put some more purple in here. If you're not happy with the effect that you got, you can always add more paint and do it again and see what happens. And you know what I think I'm going to do? I'm going to get kind of crazy and put some red in there. Go a little bit off the chains here. Okay. And I think what I'm going to do is put my salt on top of it. It might take a little bit longer to dry that way, but we're just going to see what happens. I'm going to test to see how wet that is. While we're waiting for this to dry, I'm looking at how dry. I think the salt one is ready to come off. So I'm going to come over here, and I have a trash can right next to me that I'm going to be scraping off the salt into. So I'm going to bring this to the edge of the table, and I just use my finger. However, if you don't like the way it feels, some people don't like the way it feels, which is totally fine. You can use a tool or something like that. I can use the gift card that I was using earlier. Let's push some salt into the salt water and see what happens. That might be fun too. You can experiment in whatever way you want. There's no rules to experimenting other than making sure you're taking good care of your materials. So when you take off the salt, see all these little galaxy things that are happening in here. The salt technique is definitely one of the cooler ones. Okay. So that's your salt. See all that little stuff happening in there. That is really exciting. Okay. Get all this extra, there's salt all over the place. Okay. We're gonna move back on over to our rubbing alcohol. I think this is a good amount of dryness. It's still a little bit damp, but it's not too bad. So I think we'll be fine. Okay. Bring this a little bit closer. So, what I like to do is I like to take my rubbing alcohol. Let me actually pull the camera back a little bit so you can see what I'm doing here. I like to take my rubbing alcohol, hold it on its side. It's almost empty. It's not super full at all. I like to unscrew the cap. However, if you wanted to squeeze a little bit into a cup and use it that way, that's probably a better idea. I left my little cup that I used for the salt water over in the bathroom, so I don't have that at the moment. So what I usually do is just hold it on its side so it's not spilling out, but I can reach in there with my Q-tip and get a good amount of rubbing alcohol on the Q-tip. Go ahead and come in here in your paint and tap it into it. Make it a little bit more. And you'll start to see little spots forming. Ooh, there's a good one. That's what I'm talking about right there. That's a good spot. I think I might actually pour a little bit into the cap so that I can get a better grasp of it. Yeah, there we go. Okay. So I'm going to come in here A little bit more. Tap it into the paint. And as it dries, you won't notice the effect right away, but as it's drying, you'll start to see these little eyeballs forming. And I like to squeeze them close together and see what happens. Kind of reminds me of Sully from Monsters, I think. This like blue-purple look here. And then you can do this and let it dry, and then put more colors on top of it and do the same thing and get some really cool layered effects. I know I could probably stop by now, but I'm just having a lot of fun doing this. So you can take your time, zen out, listen to some music, and just put dots over everything. This looks really cool on red, too. I originally did it with red paint, and I think I might actually have where I did that earlier. Hold my baking paper down. Let me show you where I did the red one. So there's the red and the orange. That's where I did it. So a lighter color will show up a little bit better when you use the rubbing alcohol. But I wanted to try it with the blue and purple just to see what it looked like. Okay, so that's your rubbing alcohol one. I'm going to take a moment to clean my paint water because it's kind of dirty. Okay. So next up we have the card. Now we just used the card to scrape some of the salt off the paper, but now we're going to use it for real. So there's a few different things that you can do with the card. I'm going to show you my favorite thing to do with it, but then you're welcome to keep experimenting with it in different ways. In fact, I encourage you to do that. So what I like to do is I like to do a wet on dry, but I like to make sure that the paint I'm using is pretty wet. We want to get a good chunk of paint on the paper. If it's too dry, this won't work as well as we're hoping it will. I'm just going to do a little square here. And then I'm going to take a moment and just kind of like fan it a little bit. I'm going to take my card, I'm going to put it down on the outside of the box, and I'm going to pull it. So you can sort of make fun little shapes with it. I'm going to do some shorter ones. I used a lot of water with that paint, so it went very far. However, if you use less water, like let's do an orange one over here. If you use less water, it's not going to travel as far. Now this might seem very simple and not very exciting. However, when you layer a lot of them over top of each other, like let's make an orange, let's do some yellow, let's do some greens, just go crazy, let's put some blues in there. It'll make a really fun little abstract piece of artwork. All those colors will sort of bleed into each other. Put some more, oh my gosh, I'm spraying paint everywhere. Put some more yellow in here. Now you can do more than just move in one direction with your card. You could, in theory, cut the card and get a little shape. And then we can make a flower. So I'm going to put a circle right here. I'm going to actually use this card and draw with it. Push it around whatever way you like. So you can do fireworks, flowers, little sunbursts, sunshines, anything that you want to do. It's kind of fun seeing those colors overlap, and then also when you're doing this, the paint is getting pushed around and distributed evenly, so it's actually kind of a cool way to get the paint to maybe dry a little bit faster. But a lot of little cool abstract things happen there. I'm going to do a little bit more with those. I'm going to use, I haven't used purple yet, I'm going to do that. I'm going to use the big part of the card. Pull that down and around. So this is pretty similar to the scratching technique, however the end result looks a little bit different. And I'm going to show you guys that one next, and then we'll do cling wrap. Let me actually lift off, check on my baking paper. I'm going to pull the salt off really quick just so that it doesn't take too long to dry, just for the sake of the demonstration. Okay, so scratching. Go ahead and do a wash. So I've got my paint, or my water rather, and I'm just going to do a light coat of water. And then I think I'm going to do yellow and orange again. I like that combination too. I'm going to actually do sort of like a radial sunburst sort of thing. So I'm going to put yellow in the middle. Still finding salt on my paper. Which is okay. You can combine techniques too. It's always fun. I'll do some orange. And we'll do a little bit of red on the outside. Try to blend those together. Maybe go in there with a little tad bit more orange. Okay, so take your scratching tool. Wherever you scratch, the paint is going to sort of settle into wherever you scratch. So if I sort of draw a line here, because that paint is still wet, it's going to kind of pool into those scratches. So I'm going to do a few. I'm not pressing too hard because my paper is pretty thin. And it may be hard to see. But wherever you scratch, the paper, or the paint rather, is settling into those scratches. So I'm gonna keep going with this sort of radial sunshine, sunset thing going on here. So over here the paint's not as wet, so you can see how it's not really settling into those scratches as much. Down here the paint is very wet. And if we were to put more paint on top of it, again, it would settle even more into those areas. Ooh, there's some pretty cool stuff happening over here. I want to keep that up. And as you're experimenting, you might notice other really cool things happening and want to sort of pursue them. This is sort of like a field of red poppies in front of a sunset. Okay. So that's your scratching technique. And the last one we're going to look at today is the cling wrap, which is one that I think is also really cool. Okay, so before we do anything on this paper, we're going to go ahead and take a piece of cling wrap. So I'm going to do that right now. this piece here, and I'm going to kind of wrinkle it a little bit, not like mold it up into a big ball, but give it a few little wrinkles here. Okay, so what we're going to do with this is we are going to paint directly onto the cling wrap. So, getting kind of crazy, but I'm going to take, what color should I do this time? I'm going to do purple. I want to try to get the paint on my brush where there isn't too much water. So I'm going to actually tap some water off onto the paper towel there. I want more paint than water on my brush. And I'm going to paint directly onto the surface of the cling wrap. And you see how it's sort of puddling up into all these little areas? That's what you want. That's what's going to make this look really cool. And then I think, what the heck, I'll put some blue on there too, over here. Okay, now we're going to turn the cling wrap upside down, lay it very gently on your square, and very, very gently, don't press and rub it because it's going to mess it up. Just tap it so that it sticks to the paper. We're going to give that a second to dry. I'm going to pull off my baking paper, and we got this cool effect going on over here. So we're going to give this a second, give our cling wrap a second, and I'm going to show you my other baking paper one that I did with the same set of colors. So this is the other baking paper one that I got. So sometimes things work a little bit better than others. You want to try things out. If something doesn't work the way you want it to the first time, you can do it again. It's always possible. Okay, so let's take our cling wrap and very gently peel it off, and that's one of my favorite techniques. Now, once this dries, you could do it again. You could do it with another color. I'm going to actually do that. It's pretty dry. It's not as dry as I probably normally let it get. However, I'm doing a demo, and I can't spend forever doing it. So I'm going to get a little bit more cling wrap here. Kind of rustle it up a little bit. And then, you know what? I'm going to put yellow on it. And I am going to... Is this dry? Yeah, that's pretty dry. So I'm going to actually just lay this right here so that I'm not putting it over top of the wet part of the paper. Clean my brush. Go into the yellow. Try to get a good amount of color on that brush. You should be able to see it on the brush. If your brush looks more like it just has water on it and not color, you're probably got to put a little more color on there. Ooh, this is going to be so fun. Okay, so I'm putting some yellow on top of my cling wrap. Amazing. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it upside down. Ooh, I'm so excited. And I'm going to overlap it. Eee! I get so excited sometimes when I play around with paint. Okay, give that a moment. I'm going to clean my brush off while I'm waiting. So all of these techniques, ladies, think about, you know, birthday cards, Valentine's Day cards, little personal handmade things always go over well with people. So now you have some fun techniques and people will think you are super creative when you do these things. Let's peel that off, and that looks so cool, yay! Okay, so those were 10 different watercolor techniques that you can try and experiment with. Just kind of looking here at how everything turned out. So we had our wash. So this was just putting water on the paper first and then tapping some paint into the surface. And as it dries, the effect for all of these, as they dry, the effect will get stronger and look better over time. So you can see how we got all of these little sunbursts and things like that over here in the paint. So that is really fun. Then we did the baking paper. So we took a little piece of baking paper, put down some thick areas of color first, put the baking paper on top, and then you want to try to let it dry. And when you put the baking paper on it, you want to try to see little pockets of paint forming under the paper. And you can get a pretty cool cloudy effect. And you never know what you're going to get. That's the exciting thing about it. After that, we did the salt. So we put down a few different colors of paint, or you could just do one color, it's totally up to you. And then we sprinkled some salt on top of it, and I actually want to show you the other salt that I did when I was practicing earlier. This was the other salt test that I was playing around with, and this was with blue and purple, and I just love all these little fireworks and things happening in here. It's just super fun. It almost looks like little snowflakes happening, so I love that. And then we did the salt water. I know it got kind of crazy over here, but salt water will help your paint sort of explode on the paper. So we laid down some salt water first and then tapped colors into it. What we did after that was the tissue test, so laying down some colors. This one's tricky to master because you got to make sure that you get the right amount of water and paint and make sure it's not too dry or too wet. But taking your tissue and sort of stamping it into the paper will give you that effect. Then we did the spray bottle effect. So this is where we put some colors down. It's still a little bit wet. We put some colors down and then we sprayed it, and it gives you a sort of salt effect. And actually, over here, where did I do my other? Oh, okay, so this was my other spray test. So this is just red with some water just sprayed onto the surface. And then after that, we did the rubbing alcohol. So this is where we just take a Q-tip, dip it into some rubbing alcohol, and then tap it onto the surface. And it'll sort of lighten up the paint in a few little areas. Then we did the card, which is a very hands-on sort of thing, laying down some colors, pushing them around with a piece of plastic. Then we did the scratching one, where you lay down some paint and make sure the paint is wet enough, and then when you scratch it, the paint will all soak into the scratches. And then the last one we did was the cling wrap, which gives you this really cool sort of splatter effect, which I just love, and you can layer them on top of each other. There's so many different ways that you can experiment with these techniques. So I hope you had fun experimenting with me today, and of course there's so many more things that you can do. You can play with dish soap to create bubbles. You can just do so many other fun things. So I hope that you continue to experiment and that you show me what you come up with. I will see you guys later. Take care.